The smell hit the medical tent 3 full minutes before the woman did. It arrived first as a whisper on the humid Philippine air carried on the back of the August heat like an unwelcome visitor. Then it grew stronger, thicker, until it became something you could almost see, a dark haze that seemed to crawl through the canvas walls and settle into the lungs of every man and woman inside Camp Zaragoza's field hospital. Nurse Betty Coleman from Chicago was the first to react. She had seen men die in every way a body could fail, had stood beside Dr. Samuel Washington through amputations and infections and wounds that turned strong soldiers into whimpering children. But when that smell reached her nostrils, she dropped the bandages she was holding and ran outside. One hand clamped over her mouth, the other clutching her stomach. 2 orderlies followed within seconds. Then a third. Dr. Washington looked up from the soldier whose arm he was stitching. He was 34 years old, born and raised in Alabama, educated at Howard University, when most medical schools wouldn't even let a black man through the front door. He had steady hands and tired eyes, and a reputation for never flinching, no matter what walked through his tent. In 12 years of practicing medicine through gangrene and battlefield wounds and death itself, he had never smelled anything like this. And when he discovered what was causing it, he would understand why. The sound of truck engines grinding up the dirt road announced the convoy's arrival. Through the tent opening, Washington could see the dust cloud rising against the morning sky, red and thick like Georgia clay. It was August 15, 1945, VJ Day. Victory over Japan. The radio had announced it 2 hours ago, and somewhere in America, people were dancing in the streets. Here in the Philippines, 3 miles from what used to be a Japanese stronghold, they were still counting casualties. The trucks rolled to a stop outside the medical tent. Sergeant Morrison, a thick-necked guard from somewhere in Texas, jumped down from the lead vehicle and strode toward the entrance. He was the kind of man who made his prejudices known with every word, every glance, every curl of his lip, when he had to take orders from a black officer. He stopped at the tent flap and grinned, showing teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "We got a special delivery for you, Doc." He called out, his voice dripping with something between amusement and disgust. "Fresh batch of Jap prisoners, and boy, you're gonna love this one." Washington set down his needle and thread carefully, the way his mother had taught him to handle things that mattered. He wiped his hands on a clean towel, even though they would be dirty again in minutes. It was a ritual, a small act of dignity in a place where dignity was rationed like morphine. Outside, 23 Japanese prisoners were climbing down from the trucks, their movements slow and careful, like men who had learned that sudden gestures could get you shot. 22 of them were male soldiers, most with visible wounds, all wearing the remnants of uniforms that had once been khaki, but were now the color of mud and blood and defeat. The 23rd prisoner was a woman. She appeared at the back of the second truck, clinging to the tailgate as if unsure her legs would hold her. She was small, even by Japanese standards, maybe 5 feet tall, if she stood straight, which she didn't. Her weight shifted oddly to one side, and her right leg seemed to drag as she tried to step down. She wore a tattered skirt that might have once been blue, and a stained blouse that looked like it had been white sometime in another lifetime. When her feet touched the ground, the smell exploded into the air, like a bomb going off. It wasn't just the unwashed stench of someone who hadn't bathed in weeks, though that was part of it. It wasn't just sweat or dirt or the particular odor of fear that clung to prisoners of war. This was something else entirely, something organic and wrong, something that spoke of tissue dying from the inside out of infection, so deep and so old that it had become part of the body itself. One of the guards swore and turned his head away. Another covered his nose with his sleeve, his eyes watering. Even the other prisoners, men who had been living in their own filth for weeks, edged away from her. The woman kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her dark hair tied back in a loose, greasy knot that hung between her shoulder blades. She took one step forward, then another, each movement stiff and deliberate, as if her body had to be convinced to cooperate. Her hands gripped her skirt with white-knuckled intensity, holding the fabric down as if afraid someone would tear it away. Washington watched from the tent entrance, his medical training already cataloging what he saw. The lopsided gait suggested injury to the right leg. The way she protected that side suggested pain, probably severe. The smell suggested advanced infection, possibly gangrene, possibly worse. But there was something else in her posture, something in the way she held herself that spoke not just of physical pain, but of terror so complete it had become a kind of armor. He stepped out into the sunlight, squinting against the glare. The heat hit him like a wall, but it was nothing compared to the smell. It followed the woman like a dark halo, heavy and rotten, overpowering even the hospital's usual mixture of carbolic and blood and red Philippine mud. Corporal James Nakamura, their Nisei interpreter, stood near the trucks, his hand pressed against his nose and mouth. He was a second-generation Japanese-American born in California, loyal to the United States in ways that men like Morrison would never understand or appreciate. He had been translating for prisoners for 6 months, but Washington could see in his eyes that this was different. "Corporal," Washington called out, "I need you over here." Nakamura hesitated, then walked over his steps, reluctant. Up close, the smell was even worse, intimate and invasive, like decay pressed directly against the senses. It wasn't just sweat or unwashed clothes. It was something deeper, older, eating away from the inside. The woman looked up when Washington approached, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. She was young, probably not yet 30, with features that might have been delicate before exhaustion carved them into something harder. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They weren't just afraid, Adelman. They were absolutely certain of what was about to happen to her, and that certainty was worse than fear. "Tell her she's going to be examined," Washington said quietly to Nakamura. "Tell her I'm a doctor. Tell her no one here is going to hurt her." Nakamura translated, his Japanese soft and careful. The woman's response came in a rush, words tumbling over each other, desperate and panicked. Her hands gripped her skirt even tighter, her whole body beginning to shake. "She says," Nakamura translated slowly, his voice strained, "she says she thinks you'll punish her. She was told that American soldiers, especially colored soldiers, are cruel. She says she knows she smells bad. She says she deserves whatever happens to her." The words hit Washington like a physical blow, though he kept his face carefully neutral. He had heard these things before, variations on the same theme. The Japanese propaganda had been thorough, painting American soldiers as monsters and Black American soldiers as something even worse. Demons, animals, creatures that would torture and defile and destroy. He had grown up in Alabama, where white people looked at him and saw the same things: subhuman, dangerous, less than. He had become a doctor to prove them wrong, had earned top marks. At Howard, had mastered surgical techniques that would have made him chief of surgery at any hospital in the North. But the Army had made sure he knew his place. Black doctors treated black soldiers. They didn't operate on white men. They stayed in their designated areas and kept their eyes down, and remembered that no matter how skilled their hands were, their skin color mattered more. And now here was this woman, this enemy, looking at him with the same fear that white Southerners had once looked at his father, his uncles, every black man who dared to walk down a street after dark. "Tell her," Washington said, and his voice was very quiet, very controlled, "that the smell is not punishment. Tell her it's a medical problem, and I need to find out how bad it is. Tell her that in this tent, I don't care what side she fought on or what her government told her about me. Tell her I'm a doctor, and right now that's all that matters." Nakamura translated. The woman's eyes squeezed shut, tears leaking from the corners. She gave the tiniest nod, more a tremor than actual agreement. Betty Coleman had returned to the tent, her face pale but determined. She had been born in Chicago, trained in nursing at a colored hospital that wouldn't accept white patients, and she had learned early that being good at your job wasn't enough when the world had already decided what you were worth. She stepped forward now, moving slowly, her hands visible and empty. "Honey," she said, even though the woman couldn't understand English, "we're going to help you, I promise." Between them, Washington and Betty guided the woman toward the back of the tent, where they had set up a cot behind a canvas screen. Every step seemed to cost her something, and twice she stumbled, only their hands keeping her upright. When her weight shifted wrong, she let out a small sound, half gasp, half whimper, quickly swallowed. They helped her onto the cot. The mattress creaked under her slight weight. This close in the enclosed space behind the screen, the smell became almost unbearable. Washington breathed through his mouth and pulled on fresh gloves, centering himself the way he always did before an examination. He had learned in medical school to separate what he felt from what he needed to do. It was a survival skill, one that had served him well in a world that wanted to reduce him to nothing more than his skin color. "Tell her I need to look at her leg," Washington said. "Tell her I'll be as gentle as I can." The woman's hands clutched at her skirt, holding it down with desperate strength. When Nakamura explained what needed to happen, she began to cry, silent tears running down her dirt-streaked face. She spoke again, and this time her voice broke on certain words. "She says, please don't look," Nakamura translated. "She says it's shameful. She says it's dirty. She says she knows what you'll think of her." Washington knelt beside the cot, bringing himself to eye level with the woman. He waited until she looked at him, really looked at him past the color of his skin and the uniform he wore, and everything her government had told her to believe. "Tell her," he said to Nakamura, "that I have seen every kind of wound a human body can suffer. Tell her that there is no shame in sickness or injury. Tell her that whatever is under that skirt, I've probably seen worse. And tell her that if she doesn't let me examine her soon, she's going to die." It was the truth, plain and simple. He could smell death on her, could see it in the way her body had started the slow process of shutting down. Whatever was wrong with her right leg, it had been wrong for a long time, and infections like this didn't wait for permission to spread. Nakamura translated. The woman looked at Washington for a long moment, searching his face for something. Finally, slowly, her hands loosened their grip on her skirt. Betty stepped forward to help, her movements practiced and gentle. Together, they raised the hem of the tattered fabric, lifting it carefully away from the woman's right leg. The smell intensified immediately, but Washington forced himself to focus on what he was seeing, not what his senses were screaming at him. The leg itself was a mess. The right thigh was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin mottled with shades of red and purple and black. Old bandages, filthy and stiff with dried fluids, were wrapped around the upper portion. When Washington touched the wrappings lightly, the woman flinched and bit down on her lower lip hard enough to draw blood. "We need to remove these," he said. "Betty, scissors and fresh gauze. Corporal, tell her this is going to hurt, but I have to see what's underneath." The bandages came away in layers, each one worse than the last. The inner wrappings were soaked through with discharged green and yellow and black colors that no healthy body should ever produce. The fabric stuck to the wound beneath, and Washington had to work slowly, carefully, moistening the cloth with saline solution to loosen it. When the last bandage finally came free, he had to stop for a moment, had to process what he was seeing, because it didn't make immediate sense. The wound itself was massive, a gaping opening in the lateral thigh that measured at least 6 inches long and 3 inches wide at its widest point. The edges were ragged and inflamed the tissue beneath a nightmare of necrotic flesh and active infection. But it wasn't the size of the wound that made Washington pause. It was its shape. This wasn't a battlefield injury. Shrapnel wounds were irregular, explosive tearing tissue in chaotic patterns. Bullet wounds were cleaner but different, following the trajectory of entry and exit. This wound was neither. The edges, despite the infection, showed evidence of a deliberate cut, precise and controlled. Someone had used a blade to make this incision, and they had known what they were doing. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Deep within the wound, partially obscured by pus and dead tissue, Washington could see something that absolutely should not have been there. It was fabric, foreign material that had been packed into the wound, driven deep into the muscle. And even through the decay and infection, even though it was rotting and falling apart, he recognized what it was. American military uniform material, khaki cloth with a distinctive weave. And on one visible corner, partially obscured by dried blood and tissue, he could make out part of a patch, the insignia of the 41st Infantry Division. Washington's hands, steady through countless surgeries, trembled slightly as he reached for forceps. He worked carefully, aware that Betty had gone very still beside him, that Nakamura had leaned forward, his eyes wide. The fabric came out in pieces, some of it dissolving at his touch, some of it stubbornly embedded in muscle that had tried and failed to heal around it. On one of the larger pieces, cleaner than the rest, he found writing. It was done in something dark. Probably blood, the letters small and shaky, but legible. He held it up to the light, reading words that made his breath catch in his throat. T. Miller, positive angel. Doctor. Betty's voice was barely a whisper. How did American fabric get inside a Japanese woman's leg? Washington didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the cloth, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more improbable than the last. This wasn't shrapnel carrying uniform pieces into a wound. This was deliberate. Someone had put this fabric here, had packed it deep into tissue, and based on the extent of the infection, it had been there for weeks, maybe months. He looked up at the woman on the cot. She was watching him, her eyes red from crying, her body shaking with exhaustion and fever, and something else. Something that looked almost like relief, as if a terrible secret had finally been exposed. "Corporal," Washington said, his voice hoarse, "ask her where this came from. Ask her how American uniform fabric ended up inside her leg." Nakamura asked. The woman's response was long and complicated, broken by sobs. When she finished, Nakamura turned to Washington, his face pale. "She says," he began, then stopped, swallowed, started again. "She says it's from a soldier, an American soldier named Miller. She says she couldn't let him die. She says she had to hide him, had to get him through Japanese checkpoints. She says the only place they wouldn't search was inside her own body." The words hung in the airs of the small space behind the canvas screen. Outside, the sounds of the camp continued, men talking, trucks, rumbling, the distant crack of construction as they built more structures to house the flood of prisoners and wounded. But here in this moment, there was only silence, and the smell of infection, and the impossible truth of what had just been revealed. Washington looked down at the fabric in his gloved hands. T. Miller. A name, a blood type, and one word, angel, written by someone who believed he had encountered something miraculous in the hell of war. "We need to operate," he said finally, his voice steady again, slipping back into the professional detachment that had gotten him through medical school and the Army and every impossible situation in between. "This infection is going to kill her if we don't clean it out immediately. Betty, prepare for emergency debridement. Corporal, stay close. I'm going to need you to translate throughout the procedure." He stood looking down at the woman who had carved open her own flesh to save an enemy soldier who had carried his uniform inside her body like a terrible secret, who had walked for God knows how long on a leg that must have been screaming with pain every single step. "Tell her," Washington said quietly, "that we're going to fix this. Tell her she's safe now. And tell her that if this Miller is still alive somewhere, I'm going to find him because he needs to know what she did for him." The woman listened to Nakamura's translation, and for the first time since she had arrived, something like hope flickered in her eyes. She nodded once, then lay back on the cot, surrendering herself to whatever came next. Washington turned to prepare for surgery, but his mind was already racing ahead. Somewhere in the massive bureaucracy of the United States Army, there would be records, casualty reports, lists of missing soldiers. And if Private Miller was still alive, if he had made it out of whatever situation had left pieces of his uniform inside this woman's leg, then Washington would find him. Because this story, this impossible act of mercy in the middle of a brutal war, deserved to be known. The surgery took 4 hours. Washington worked with methodical precision, cutting away dead tissue, irrigating the wound with saline, removing every trace of infected material he could find. Betty assisted with practiced efficiency, anticipating his needs, counting instruments, monitoring the woman's vital signs. Nakamura stayed at the head of the cot, translating Washington's explanations, offering what comfort he could, with words the woman might or might not truly hear through the haze of pain. They had morphine, but not enough to fully anesthetize someone for a procedure this extensive. The woman bore it with a stoicism that broke Washington's heart. She cried, yes, and sometimes she screamed, but she never tried to pull away, never fought them. It was as if she had already survived something so terrible that this was just another trial to be endured. As he worked deeper into the wound, Washington found more fabric pieces, each one carefully packed into the muscle. Each one a deliberate act by someone who had known exactly what she was doing. The woman had training, he realized, medical training. You didn't create a wound this precise, didn't pack it this carefully without understanding anatomy. "Ask her," he said during a brief pause while Betty swabbed the field, if she was a nurse. The answer came back affirmative. She had been a volunteer nurse in a village north of here, caring for civilians and wounded soldiers alike. Her husband had been killed at Guadalcanal. She had hated the war, hated what it did to people, hated watching mothers cry over sons who would never come home. And then one day she had found an American soldier dying in the jungle, and she had made a choice. When the surgery was finally complete, when every piece of foreign material had been removed and the wound cleaned and properly dressed, Washington stripped off his gloves and stepped back. The woman was unconscious now, exhausted and weak from blood loss and the body's desperate fight against infection that had been raging for too long. "Will she survive?" Betty asked quietly. Washington looked at the pale face on the pillow, the steady rise and fall of breathing, the bandaged leg that might or might not heal properly after everything it had been through. "I don't know," he admitted. "The infection was severe. We got it cleaned out, but her body has been fighting this for weeks, maybe months. She's malnourished, dehydrated, and exhausted. The next 72 hours will tell us everything." He walked to the basin and washed his hands, scrubbing away the blood and the surgical residue, watching the water run red, and then pink, and then finally clear. His reflection in the small mirror above the basin looked tired, older than 34, worn down by too many surgeries and too many deaths and too many reminders that the world saw him as less than human because of the color of his skin. But today in this tent he had saved a life, or at least given that life a chance. And he had uncovered a story that needed to be told, a story about a woman who had chosen mercy over hatred, compassion over propaganda, human life over the convenient lies of war. He dried his hands and turned to Nakamura. "I need you to come with me to the records tent. We need to find out if there's a Private T. Miller anywhere in the system. And if he's alive, we need to locate him." "You think he made it?" Nakamura asked. Washington looked back at the canvas screen that separated them from the woman who had sacrificed so much for a stranger, an enemy, someone she had been taught to hate and fear. "I think," he said slowly, "that if she was willing to do what she did to save him, then he damn well better have survived. Because if he didn't, if she went through all of that for nothing, then I don't know what that says about this war or any of us." They found Corporal Davis in the records tent, a thin, nervous man from Pennsylvania who kept track of personnel files with obsessive precision. When Washington explained what they needed, Davis's eyebrows rose toward his hairline, but he didn't ask questions. He just started pulling files, cross-referencing rosters, checking casualty reports, and missing in action lists. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes during which Washington stood in the hot tent listening to the rustle of paper, wondering what he would do if Miller was dead, if all of this had been for nothing. Then Davis looked up, his expression strange. "Found him," he said. "Private Thomas Miller, 22nd, 41st Infantry, 2nd Battalion. Listed as MIA since June 12th of this year. Last known position was northern Luzon, Philippine Islands." MIA? Washington felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Not KIA. No, sir, missing in action. There's a note here that guerrilla forces reported possibly recovering an American soldier in late June, but no confirmation of identity. The soldier was severely wounded and evacuated to a field hospital somewhere in the region." Davis flipped through more pages. "There's a recent update, actually, dated August 10th. Soldier confirmed as Private Miller, currently recovering at Clark Field Hospital." Washington had to sit down. He found a crate and lowered himself onto it, his legs suddenly unsteady. Miller was alive. Against all odds, despite being missing in action for 2 months, despite wounds severe enough to require evacuation, he had survived. Which meant the woman currently unconscious in Washington's medical tent had succeeded. She had saved him. Everything she had done, all the pain she had endured, the infection she had allowed to ravage her body, rather than risk exposing her secret, it had not been in vain. "Corporal Washington," said to Nakamura, his voice rough, "I need you to send a message to Clark Field Hospital. Tell them we have information about Private Miller that he needs to know immediately. Tell them it's urgent, and tell them it's about the person who saved his life." He stood and walked back toward the medical tent, his mind full of questions that would take time to answer. How had Miller gotten wounded? How had this woman found him? What had possessed her to make such an impossible choice to carve open her own flesh to hide evidence of an enemy soldier, to endure weeks of agony, to keep him safe? And most importantly, what would happen when Miller learned what she had done? What could anyone possibly say or do that would be adequate payment for such a sacrifice? The sun was setting over Camp Zaragoza, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple. In the medical tent, the woman lay sleeping, her fever starting to break, her body finally allowed to begin the slow process of healing. Beside her cot, Washington sat and watched the steady rhythm of her breathing, this enemy who had chosen mercy, this stranger who had proven that humanity could survive even in the darkest places. And he thought about the fabric he had carefully preserved, the writing done in blood, that single word that someone had written while believing he was going to die. Angel, the angel who smelled like hell, the savior who had arrived covered in the stench of infection and death. The enemy who had turned out to be the most heroic person Washington had ever encountered. Tomorrow he would contact Clark Field. Tomorrow he would try to arrange for Miller to come here, to see what his salvation had cost, to understand the depth of what had been done for him. Tomorrow there would be questions and paperwork, and the impossible task of explaining to his superiors why he was involving himself so deeply in the story of one Japanese prisoner of war. But tonight he simply sat and kept watch over a woman who had reminded him why he had become a doctor in the first place. Not to serve a segregated army or to prove anything to white men who would never see him as an equal, but because sometimes in the midst of horror and hatred and war, you got the chance to save a life. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got to witness what real courage looked like. It smelled, he had learned, like hell itself, but it looked like grace. 3 days passed before Haruko Tanaka was strong enough to tell her story. Washington checked on her every 4 hours, monitoring the fever that spiked and fell like ocean waves, watching for signs that the infection might be winning despite his best efforts. Betty stayed close, changing bandages, administering what little penicillin they could spare, speaking in soft tones that needed no translation to convey their meaning. And Nakamura came by twice each day, ready to bridge the gap between languages, between worlds that had been at war for 4 brutal years. On the morning of August 18th, Washington arrived to find Haruko sitting up, her back propped against folded blankets, her eyes clearer than they had been since she arrived. The smell had diminished significantly, replaced by the sharp medicinal scent of carbolic and iodine. It wasn't pleasant, but it was the smell of healing, not death. "She wants to talk," Betty said quietly. "She's been asking for you since dawn." Washington pulled up a wooden chair and sat beside the cot. Nakamura positioned himself where both could see him, ready to translate. For a long moment, Haruko simply looked at Washington, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him wonder what she was seeking there. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, and Nakamura began to translate almost immediately, his words flowing in rhythm with hers. "She says her name is Haruko Tanaka. She is 27 years old, from Hiroshima. She was a nurse before the war, trained at a civilian hospital. Her husband, Kenji Tanaka, was a school teacher. He was drafted in 1942 and died at Guadalcanal in 1943. Washington nodded, saying nothing, letting the story unfold at its own pace. After Kenji died, she could not stay in Hiroshima. Everything there reminded her of what she had lost. She volunteered to work in the Philippines, caring for wounded soldiers and displaced civilians. She was assigned to a village called San Rafael, about 30 kilometers north of here, in the mountains where fighting was still active this spring. Haruko paused, accepting water from Betty, sipping carefully before continuing. "She says she hated the war, hated what it did to people, to families, to the young men who died believing they were defending something worth dying for. But she was just one person, and the war was so much bigger than any single person could resist." Another pause. Haruko's hands twisted the edge of her blanket, and Washington noticed for the first time how delicate they were, the fingers long and precise. Surgeon's hands, or at least a healer's hands. And then, on June 12, 1945, she found something in the jungle that changed everything. The story that emerged over the next hour was so improbable, so impossible, that Washington had to remind himself he was looking at living proof of its truth. Haruko told it in careful detail, and as Nakamura translated, Washington found himself transported to a jungle clearing, 2 months and 3,000 miles of experience away from this tent. Haruko had been gathering medicinal plants in the forest near San Rafael, plants that grew only in the deep jungle where sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. It was dangerous work, but necessary. The village clinic had almost nothing left, and people were suffering from wounds and diseases that traditional medicines could help if only someone was brave enough to venture into the forest to find them. She heard him before she saw him, a low, groaning sound, almost animal, coming from somewhere off the path. Her first instinct was to run. Japanese patrols had warned that American soldiers were in the area, that they were dangerous, that any civilian who encountered them should report immediately to the military police or risk being accused of collaboration. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and Haruko found herself moving toward it instead of away. Perhaps it was her training as a nurse. Perhaps it was the memory of Kenji dying alone on some Pacific island while she was powerless to help him. Perhaps it was simply that she had seen too much death and could not walk away from another. She found him in a depression beneath a fallen tree, half covered by leaves and mud. An American soldier, young, probably not even 25 years old. He had been shot through the abdomen, a wound that had bled extensively, before clotting into a terrible mass of dried blood and torn uniform. His face was gray with blood loss and shock, his breathing shallow and rapid. Next to him, fallen into the mud, was a photograph of a young woman and an elderly lady, both smiling at the camera, with the kind of innocent happiness that belonged to a world without war. The soldier's eyes opened when Haruko approached, and she saw the fear there, the certainty that she would finish what the bullet had started. His hand moved weakly toward the photograph fingers, scrabbling in the mud, trying to reach it one last time. Haruko knelt beside him and picked up the photograph, wiping it clean on her sleeve before placing it carefully in his hand. His fingers closed around it, and tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. "Tasukete," he whispered, using one of the few Japanese words he knew. "Help." And Haruko made a decision that would cost her almost everything. She could not carry him alone. He was too heavy, too badly wounded, and the path back to the village was too treacherous. But there was a small storage hut about a kilometer away where she kept medical supplies hidden from the frequent patrols that came through searching for contraband. If she could get him there, she might be able to keep him alive long enough to figure out what to do next. It took her 2 hours to drag him to the hut using a makeshift stretcher fashioned from bamboo and her own jacket. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out in pain, sometimes mumbling words she could not understand. English, she assumed, though she knew none of that language beyond a handful of words picked up from propaganda leaflets. Once inside the hut, hidden from view, she began the desperate work of trying to save his life. She boiled water over a small fire, sterilized a knife in the flames, and prepared herself for what had to be done. The bullet was still inside him, lodged somewhere in his lower abdomen, and if she did not get it out, infection would kill him within days. She had no anesthesia, nothing to dull the pain except a strip of leather for him to bite down on. When she made the first incision, following the wound track with shaking hands, he screamed so loudly she was certain someone would hear. But the jungle was thick here, and the nearest patrol was miles away, and somehow the sound dissolved into the vast indifference of the forest. The extraction took 3 hours. By the time she finally pulled the misshapen bullet free, both she and the soldier were soaked in sweat and blood. He had passed out from the pain, which was probably a mercy, and she worked in the silence that followed to pack the wound with medicinal leaves that would fight infection and promote healing. For 3 days, she cared for him in that hidden hut, sneaking away from her duties at the village clinic whenever she could, bringing him water and thin broth and changing his bandages. He drifted in and out of fever, sometimes lucid enough to look at her with confusion and gratitude, sometimes lost in delirium, where he called out for someone named Emily and begged his mother to forgive him for things Haruko could not understand. On the 4th day, she arrived at dawn to find him awake and alert, his eyes following her movements with sharp intelligence. He tried to speak, gestured at himself, at her, at the world outside the hut. She did not understand his words, but his meaning was clear. "Why? Why are you doing this? Why haven't you turned me in?" Haruko showed him the photograph she had preserved, the 2 women who loved him, who were waiting for him to come home. She pointed at his heart, then at the women in the picture, then at her own heart, where she kept the memory of Kenji. Some things she tried to communicate were more important than war. Some lives were worth saving, even if they belonged to the enemy. He understood, or seemed to. He took her hand and held it gently, and tears ran down his face as he spoke words she could not comprehend, but whose meaning was unmistakable. "Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you." She learned later that his name was Miller. Private Thomas Miller, from a place called Dayton in a state called Ohio. He wrote it for her on a scrap of paper along with his blood type and unit designation, teaching her how to pronounce the sounds. Miller, Tom Mai, words that felt strange in her mouth, foreign and awkward, but that became familiar through repetition. And then on the morning of June 15th, everything changed. A village boy came running to the hut, breathless and terrified. Japanese military police were coming. He gasped. Kenpei, the dreaded Kenpei Tai, who answered to no one and showed no mercy. They were searching for an American soldier reported missing in the area. They would check every building, every hut, every possible hiding place. And they were less than an hour away. Miller was healing, but still far too weak to travel. Even standing made him dizzy, and any significant exertion would reopen the wound in his abdomen. He could not run, could not hide, could not defend himself. If the Kenpeitai found him, they would execute him immediately, and Haruko and probably the entire village would be killed alongside him for the crime of harboring an enemy. Haruko stood in that small hut and calculated impossible odds. She could not move Miller. She could not hide him anywhere the Kenpeitai would not search. The only places they would not look were places that seemed medically impossible to conceal anything. She looked down at her own body, at the anatomy she had studied in nursing school, at the structure of muscle and tissue she understood in precise detail, and an idea formed terrible and desperate and completely insane. The human thigh contained large muscle groups, the vastus medialis, the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis. Deep tissue that could in theory be separated to create a cavity, a space where something small could be hidden, packed away inside the body itself, where no external search would ever find it. She explained it to Miller using gestures and the few words they shared. His horror was immediate and absolute. He shook his head violently, tried to get up despite his weakness, grabbed her hands to stop her when she reached for her medical knife. No, no, he would not allow it. He would rather die than let her do this to herself. But Haruko had already made her decision. She spoke to him firmly in Japanese, knowing he could not understand the words, but hoping he would understand the conviction behind them. He had a mother. He had someone named Emily who loved him. He had a life waiting for him in a place called Ohio. She had no one left. Kenji was dead and her family was scattered or killed in the bombing campaigns. Her life had value only in what she could do for others, and right now the most valuable thing she could do was ensure that one more mother did not lose her son. She took a strip of leather and put it between her teeth. She sterilized the knife in boiling water one more time, and then while Miller watched in helpless anguish, she made the first incision in her own right thigh. The pain was beyond anything she had imagined. She had witnessed surgeries, had assisted in procedures, had thought she understood what it meant to cut into living flesh. But knowing and experiencing were separated by an abyss of agony that threatened to drag her under with every second. She cut deep, separating muscle fibers, creating a pocket in the vastus lateralis large enough to hold what she needed to hide. Blood flowed hot and fast, and she had to pause several times to maintain her vision, to keep her hands steady enough to complete what she had started. Miller was crying, begging her to stop in words she could not understand. But she continued, driven by a determination that went beyond rational thought, beyond self-preservation, into some territory of pure will. When the cavity was ready, she took Miller's jacket, the one that identified him as American military, that bore his unit patch and blood type. She cut it into strips with scissors, soaked them in his blood, and wrote on the cleanest piece with a fingertip dipped in red, T. Miller. O, positive. And one more word, the only English word she knew that seemed to fit. Angel, because that was what he had called her in his delirium, she thought. Or perhaps because that was what she needed to believe she was in order to justify this madness. She packed the strips of fabric deep into her thigh, filling the cavity she had created, embedding them in muscle that would try to heal around the foreign material. Then she stitched the wound closed with the same fishing line she had used on Miller's abdomen, her hands shaking now, her vision going dark at the edges. The entire procedure took perhaps 30 minutes. When it was done, she bound her leg tightly with clean cloth and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to lie still and breathe through the worst of the pain. Then she helped Miller to his feet. She gave him a map she had drawn showing the way east to where Filipino guerrilla forces operated resistance fighters who would help an American soldier reach safety. 30 kilometers through jungle, she told him through gestures. Maybe 2 days if he moved slowly and carefully. He would have to go now immediately before the Kenpeitai arrived. Miller understood. He also understood what she had done, what it would cost her. He knelt before her, this enemy soldier, and pressed his forehead to her hands. Then he took the photograph of his mother and his fiancée Emily and pressed it into her palm. Keep it, his gesture said, so you remember that what you did mattered, so you know that someone will be grateful for the rest of their lives. Haruko tucked the photograph into her blouse. She watched Miller disappear into the jungle, limping, but moving, heading east toward possible salvation. And then she cleaned up all evidence of his presence, scattered the ashes of his discarded bandages, wiped away the bloodstains as best she could. When the Kenpeitai arrived 20 minutes later, they found her at the village clinic, treating a child's infected wound, her own leg carefully hidden beneath her skirt. They searched every building, interrogated every person threatened and bullied, and made it clear what would happen to anyone who had helped an American soldier. But they found nothing. Lieutenant Sakamoto, the officer in charge, noticed Haruko limping and demanded to know what was wrong. She told him she had fallen from a ladder the day before a clumsy accident that had injured her leg. He looked skeptical but had no reason to doubt her. Women hurt themselves in foolish ways all the time. It was beneath his concern. The patrol moved on, still searching, still certain that somewhere in these mountains, an American soldier was hiding. And inside Haruko's thigh, wrapped in her own muscle and tissue, pieces of Miller's uniform began the slow process of causing an infection that would nearly kill her. Washington sat motionless as Nakamura finished translating his mind, struggling to process what he had heard. The deliberate self-infliction, the calculated risk, the absolute certainty that saving one life was worth destroying her own health. It was beyond courage. It was something else entirely, something that had no name in any language he knew. "How long," he asked quietly, "did you carry the fabric inside you?" Haruko's answer came swift and firm. 2 months. From June 15th to August 15th. 61 days of progressive infection of pain that grew worse with every passing hour of fever and swelling, and the constant smell of tissue dying inside her body. Why didn't you remove it once Miller was safe? Because she did not know if he was safe. Because Japanese patrols were everywhere. And if they caught her with physical evidence of an American soldier, they would execute her and everyone she knew. Because once the infection started, she was too weak to perform surgery on herself. Because by the time she realized how bad it had become, removing the fabric would have caused bleeding she could not control alone. And the checkpoints, 4 of them, 4 times she had to walk past Japanese soldiers while infection raged in her leg, while the smell grew stronger and more distinctive. At the first checkpoint, they had questioned her limp. At the second, they had recoiled from the odor. At the third, a young soldier had wanted to call a medic. Each time she had convinced them it was a female problem, something shameful that men did not discuss, and they had waved her through rather than deal with the embarrassment. The 4th checkpoint had been Americans after Manila fell. They had assumed she was just another sick prisoner and loaded her onto a truck bound for the nearest field hospital, which had brought her here to this tent to a black doctor who had looked at her with compassion instead of contempt, who had seen past the smell and the infection to the story written in scar tissue and suffering. Washington stood and walked to the window of the tent, looking out at the compound where soldiers moved in the afternoon heat. He was thinking about Miller recovering at Clark Field Hospital, probably with no idea that the woman who saved him had nearly died to protect his secret. About the impossible choice Haruko had made to value his life above her own comfort, her own safety, her own survival. And he was thinking about the telegram he had sent 3 days ago, marked urgent, requesting that Private Miller be transported to Camp Zaragoza at the earliest opportunity. If the Army bureaucracy worked with any efficiency at all, Miller might arrive within days. "There's something else," Haruko said through Nakamura, her voice softer now. "Something I need to ask." Washington turned back to face her. "Is he alive, Miller? Did he survive? Or did I do all of this for nothing?" Washington walked back to the cot and sat down, taking care that his expression gave nothing away until he was ready. Private Thomas Miller was recovered by Filipino guerrilla forces in late June. He was severely wounded but alive. He was evacuated to Clark Field Hospital, where he spent 6 weeks recovering from his injuries. And yes, he is still alive. He watched the relief flood Haruko's face, watched the tears start again, watched her hands come up to cover her mouth as if to hold in the sob that escaped anyway. Betty moved closer, put a hand on her shoulder, and Haruko reached up to grip it like a lifeline. "There's more," Washington continued. "I sent word to Clark Field 3 days ago. If the message reached him, and if his commanding officer approves, Private Miller will be here soon. He's going to want to see you. He's going to want to know what you did for him." Haruko's eyes went wide. She spoke rapidly to Nakamura, who translated with a slight smile. "She says she does not need to see him. She says knowing he is alive is enough. She says she does not want gratitude or recognition. She only wanted him to live." Washington shook his head slowly. "That may be what you want, but I think Miller deserves the chance to say thank you. I think he deserves to understand what his survival cost. And I think you deserve to see that your sacrifice was not in vain, that the man you saved is real and grateful and alive because of what you chose to do. He stood and prepared to leave to give Haruko time to rest and process everything that had been said. But at the tent flap, he paused and turned back. One more thing. What you did cutting open your own leg to hide evidence of an enemy soldier carrying an infection for 2 months, rather than risk his discovery, that was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed in 12 years of practicing medicine. And I have seen Medal of Honor recipients and men who threw themselves on grenades to save their friends. What you did was braver than any of that because you did it alone in secret with no expectation of recognition or reward. You did it simply because it was right. He let Nakamura translate, watched the words sink in, watched Haruko's face as she processed the idea that someone saw her actions not as foolishness or treason, but as heroism. "Thank you," she whispered in English, the first English words Washington had heard her speak. Her accent was heavy, the pronunciation uncertain, but the meaning was clear. "No," Washington replied. "Thank you for reminding me why I became a doctor, for showing me that mercy is not weakness, for proving that even in the worst of wars, humanity can survive." He left her, then stepping out into the bright afternoon sun, his mind already turning to the logistics of what would happen when Miller arrived. There would be questions from his superiors, concerns about fraternization with prisoners' protocols that would be difficult to navigate. But Washington had made his decision. Miller would meet Haruko. They would have their reunion, their chance to close the circle of sacrifice and salvation. And if the army did not like it, they could add it to the long list of complaints they already had about a black doctor who did not know his place. That evening, as the sun set over Camp Zaragoza, in bands of orange and purple, a jeep arrived carrying a single passenger. Private Thomas Miller, thin and scarred, and moving with the careful stiffness of someone still healing, climbed out and stood staring at the medical tent as if it were a church or a shrine or some other sacred place. Washington met him at the entrance. This young farm boy from Ohio, who had been dead and then wasn't, who had been saved by an angel who smelled like hell. "Dr. Washington," Miller's voice cracked slightly, "your message said you found her. The woman who saved me. Is she really here?" Washington nodded. "She's here, and she's alive. Barely, but alive. What she did to hide you, Private, what she put herself through, I need you to understand before you go in there." He told Miller everything. The self-inflicted wound, the fabric packed into muscle, the 2 months of infection, the 4 checkpoints, the certain knowledge that discovery meant death. He watched Miller's face go pale, watched the tears start, watched understanding dawn about just how much his life had cost someone he had known for less than a week. "I need to see her," Miller whispered. "Right now, please." Washington led him into the tent past the rows of wounded soldiers to the canvas screen in the back, where Haruko lay resting. Betty was with her, and Nakamura had been summoned to translate. When Miller stepped around the screen and saw her, this small woman with dark circles under her eyes and a heavily bandaged leg, he made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. He fell to his knees beside the cot, and Haruko opened her eyes and stared at him as if she were seeing a ghost, or a miracle, or both. "Miller-san," she whispered. "Ikite iru. Are you alive?" "Yes," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, I'm alive. Because of you, because you did something so impossible, so brave, I don't even have words for it." Nakamura translated, and Haruko smiled for the first time since arriving, the smile that transformed her exhausted face into something radiant. They talked for over an hour with Nakamura translating every word, every nuance. Miller told her about the guerrillas who found him, about the weeks in the field hospital, about the letter he had tried to write her knowing he had no way to send it. Haruko told him about the checkpoints, about the infection, about the moment she had realized what she had to do to save him. And Washington watched from a respectful distance, bearing witness to something he would remember for the rest of his life. 2 people from enemy nations, one who had saved the other at unimaginable cost, reunited not as enemies, but as proof that mercy could exist even in hell. When visiting hours ended and Miller had to leave, he pressed something into Haruko's hands. A new jacket, American military issue, to replace the one she had destroyed. And a letter written in English she could not yet read, but that Nakamura would translate for her. It said simply, "You are the reason I believe in goodness. You are the reason I will never hate. You are the angel who smelled like hell and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve what you did for me." Miller left with a promise to return the next day and every day until he was redeployed. And Haruko lay back on her cot, clutching the jacket in the letter, her face peaceful in a way it had not been since before the war. Outside, Washington stood with Betty and watched the stars emerge over the Philippine jungle. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Betty said quietly. Washington nodded. "And the most important. Because if Mercy can survive what they survived, then maybe there's hope for all of us." The angel who smelled like hell had brought her gift of grace. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone who witnessed it that some things matter more than war, more than sides, more than all the hate and fear and propaganda in the world. Some things, like one life saved at the cost of everything, could never be measured or repaid. They could only be honored. The news traveled fast through Camp Zaragoza. Within 2 days, every soldier in the compound had heard some version of the story about the Japanese woman who carved open her own leg to save an American. Some details got exaggerated in the retelling, the way stories do when they pass from mouth to mouth. Some got simplified, but the core truth remained constant, impossible to dismiss or diminish. An enemy had chosen Mercy, and it had nearly killed her. Colonel Patterson summoned Washington to his office on the third day after Miller's arrival. Patterson was a career officer from Virginia, a man who believed in regulations and chain of command and the proper order of things. He sat behind a field desk covered in papers and maps, his expression unreadable. "I've been hearing remarkable things about one of your patients, Dr." Patterson began without preamble. "A Japanese prisoner who allegedly saved the life of one of our soldiers. I need you to explain the situation to me, all of it, and I need to know why you've been allowing Private Miller to visit her daily without proper authorization." Washington had known this conversation was coming. He had prepared for it, though preparation felt inadequate when trying to explain the unexplainable. "Sir, with respect, what happened between Private Miller and Miss Tanaka is beyond anything covered by standard protocol. She found him dying in the jungle. She performed field surgery on him with no anesthesia and minimal supplies. She hid him from Japanese patrols for 3 days. And when those patrols came looking for him, she cut open her own leg and packed pieces of his uniform inside her body so she could carry him through 4 military checkpoints without being discovered." Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're telling me this woman deliberately wounded herself, inflicted what amounts to a serious injury on her own body?" "Yes, sir. I removed the fabric myself during surgery. American military uniform material packed deep into the vastus lateralis muscle. It had been there for approximately 2 months, causing massive infection. Another week and she would have died from sepsis." Patterson stood and walked to the window, looking out at the compound. "And Private Miller corroborates this story." "Every detail, sir. He was there when she did it. He tried to stop her, but she insisted. She told him through gestures that his life was worth more than her comfort, that his mother and his fiancée deserved to have him come home." A long silence filled the office. Patterson turned back, his face troubled. "The problem, doctor, is that according to regulations, she's still an enemy combatant, a prisoner of war. The fact that she performed an act of mercy doesn't change her legal status. I have people in command asking me why we're giving special treatment to a Japanese prisoner, why she's being housed in the medical tent instead of the POW compound, why an American private is being allowed daily visits." Washington had expected this argument. He had an answer ready, though he knew it was inadequate. "Sir, with respect, Miss Tanaka was never a combatant. She was a civilian nurse caring for wounded in a village. She carried no weapons, held no military rank, engaged in no hostile action against American forces. The only thing she's guilty of is saving the life of an enemy soldier. If that's a crime, then we need to reconsider what we're fighting for." Before Patterson could respond, there was a knock at the door. Sergeant Morrison entered, his expression uncertain in a way Washington had never seen before. "Begging your pardon, Colonel, but Private Miller is outside. He says he needs to speak on behalf of the prisoner. Says it's urgent." Patterson nodded, and Miller entered, still moving carefully, his uniform pressed, and his posture as military as his healing body would allow. He saluted smartly. "Sir, I understand there are questions about Miss Tanaka's status. I'm here to provide testimony about what she did for me and to formally request that she be reclassified as a protected person under the Geneva Convention. Patterson gestured for Miller to continue. What followed was the most articulate speech Washington had ever heard from the young private. Miller described finding himself bleeding out in the jungle, certain he was going to die. He described Haruko's face when she discovered him, the decision he saw her make in real time, choosing mercy over the safety of walking away. He described 3 days of careful nursing of her, sharing her meager food of her changing his bandages, and singing soft songs in Japanese that he could not understand but that somehow made the pain more bearable. And then he described watching her cut into her own flesh. Sir, I begged her not to do it. I told her to leave me to let the Japanese find me, that I would rather die than have her hurt herself. But she refused. She looked at a photograph of my mother and my fiancé, and she made a choice. She decided that my life, the life of her enemy, was worth more than her own safety. Miller's voice broke slightly. He took a breath and continued. For 2 months she carried pieces of my uniform inside her body. 2 months of infection and pain, and the risk of being discovered at any moment. She walked through Japanese checkpoints while her leg was rotting from the inside out, and she never gave me up. Sir, if that woman is the enemy, then I don't understand what we're fighting for anymore. The silence that followed was absolute. Patterson sat down slowly, his expression thoughtful. Private Miller, are you aware that what you're describing, if true, represents one of the most extraordinary acts of mercy documented in this war? Yes, sir, that's exactly what it is, and that's why she can't be treated like a regular prisoner. She's not our enemy. She never was. Patterson looked at Washington. Doctor, in your medical opinion, did this woman's actions save Private Miller's life? Without question, sir. The bullet wound alone would have killed him from blood loss or infection within days. Her field surgery, performed under impossible conditions, gave him the chance to survive long enough to reach help. Patterson turned to Morrison. Sergeant, you were there when this prisoner arrived. What's your assessment? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. This was the man who had made racist comments about Washington, who had referred to Haruko as a Jap bitch, who represented everything ugly about prejudice, dressed in a uniform. What he said next shocked everyone in the room. Sir, I was wrong about her. I was wrong about a lot of things. Morrison looked directly at Washington. I was wrong about Dr. Washington, too. I let my prejudices do my thinking for me, and I'm ashamed of it. That woman out there, she's got more courage than most of the soldiers I've served with. What she did hurting herself like that to save an enemy, that's something I don't think I could do. And if we punish her for it, if we treat her like the enemy after what she sacrificed, then we're no better than the propaganda says we are. Patterson absorbed this, his fingers drumming on the desk. Finally, he nodded. I'm going to make a decision that will probably get me a reprimand from command. But I'm going to make it anyway because Private Miller is right. If we punish mercy, we've lost something essential. He pulled out a form and began writing. Effective immediately, Miss Haruko Tanaka is reclassified as a humanitarian civilian under special protection status. She will remain at Camp Zaragoza as a volunteer medical assistant working under Dr. Washington's supervision. She is not a prisoner. She is not detained. She is a protected person who performed an extraordinary act of humanitarian service. He signed the form with a flourish and looked up. Private Miller, you're authorized to visit Miss Tanaka during appropriate hours. Dr. Washington, she remains under your medical care until fully recovered. Sergeant Morrison, you will ensure that all guards and personnel are informed of her new status and that she is treated with appropriate respect. Patterson stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Gentlemen, what happened here, what this woman did, it needs to be documented properly. It needs to be remembered. Because in a few years, when this war is just history, people need to know that even in the darkest times, human beings were capable of extraordinary goodness. Dismissed. They filed out and Washington found himself walking beside Morrison. That took courage, Sergeant, Washington said quietly. What you said in there. Morrison stopped and turned to face him. I owe you an apology, Doctor, a real one, not just words in front of the Colonel. I've been treating you like you were less than me because of the color of your skin. And then I watched you save that woman's life, watched you treat her with dignity when everyone else wanted to turn away, and I realized I've been on the wrong side of things my whole life. He extended his hand. Washington looked at it for a moment, this hand that had belonged to a man who despised him, that now offered something like respect or redemption or both. He shook it. People can change, Sergeant. That's what this whole story is about. Haruko changed from believing we were monsters to trusting us with her life. You changed from prejudice to understanding. Maybe that's the real victory here. Over the following days, something remarkable happened at Camp Zaragoza. Soldiers who had initially viewed Haruko with suspicion or contempt began to see her differently. They watched her work in the medical tent, assisting Betty with bandages and medications, her movements careful because of her healing leg, but her dedication absolute. They saw Miller visit her every afternoon, bringing small gifts, teaching her English words, laughing with her over pronunciation mistakes. And they heard the full story spread by Morrison, of all people, who seemed determined to atone for his earlier prejudice by becoming Haruko's most vocal defender. Betty worked with Haruko daily, teaching her the English names for medical supplies, showing her American nursing techniques, forming a friendship that transcended language barriers. One afternoon, Betty brought something special. "I want you to try something," Betty said, Nakamura translating. She pulled out a warm bottle of Coca-Cola and a Hershey's chocolate bar. "These are American treasures. Everyone should taste them at least once." Haruko accepted the bottle, carefully looking at the brown liquid with uncertainty. She took a small sip and immediately coughed as the carbonation hit her throat. Then she started laughing, a sound that Washington realized he had never heard from her before. It was light and genuine and completely unself-conscious. "She says it tingles like medicine," Nakamura translated, grinning. "But sweet medicine. Happy medicine." Miller arrived during this moment, carrying his own gift. A baseball scuffed and worn from the game American soldiers and Japanese prisoners had played the previous week. "I want you to have this," he said through Nakamura. "In America, baseball is how we show that competition doesn't have to mean hatred. We play hard, we try to win, but at the end we shake hands. This ball represents something we played last week, Americans and Japanese together. Enemies becoming teammates, even if just for a few hours." Haruko turned the ball over in her hands, feeling the stitching, the leather worn smooth by use. She spoke softly and Nakamura translated. "She says in Japan they also play baseball. She says her husband Kenji loved the game. She says this gift makes her believe that maybe someday the two countries can play together without it being remarkable." Miller knelt beside her cot, and Washington watched as this young soldier, who had been taught to hate the Japanese, who had fought and nearly died in battle against them, took the hand of a Japanese woman and held it gently. "You gave me my life back," Miller said. "And I don't just mean keeping me alive. You gave me the ability to believe that people are good, that mercy matters, that we're not just the worst things our countries do to each other." He reached into his pocket and pulled out another item, something he had been carrying since his arrival, a small American flag pin. "When you came to America someday, and I hope you will, I want you to have this. Not because you need to become American, but because you've already shown more of what America should be than most Americans ever will. You chose mercy. You chose life. You chose to see a human being instead of an enemy. That's the America I want to believe in." Washington felt his throat tighten as he watched this exchange. Betty was crying openly. Even Nakamura had to pause in his translation to wipe his eyes. 3 weeks after Haruko's arrival at Camp Zaragoza, Washington made a final examination of her leg. The infection was gone, the wound healing cleanly, though she would carry a significant scar for the rest of her life. She would also walk with a slight limp, the muscle damage too extensive to fully repair. "The scar will fade some with time," Washington told her through Nakamura, "but it will always be visible. I'm sorry I couldn't do more." Haruko's response surprised him. She says she's glad for the scar. She says it reminds her that mercy has a cost, that love requires sacrifice. She says she'll never hide it, never be ashamed of it. She says it's the mark of the most important thing she ever did in her life. September arrived, and with it came the inevitable. Miller's unit was being redeployed, first to Japan as part of the occupation force, then home to the United States. And Haruko, like all Japanese civilians in the Philippines, would be part of the repatriation program, sent back to a Japan that had been devastated by bombing and defeat. The morning of Miller's departure, he came to the medical tent one last time. He brought Haruko a care package carefully assembled over days. A new jacket to replace the one she had destroyed, saving him. A box of Hershey's bars. a handwritten letter in English that Nakamura had helped him compose explaining everything he felt but could never adequately say, and $50, all the money he had saved from his military pay. "I know it's not much," Miller said, "but I want you to have it, and I want you to have this too." He gave her a piece of paper with an address written carefully in block letters, 412 Maple Street, Dayton, Ohio, United States of America. "That's my family's house, my mother's house. I've already written to her about you, told her everything you did. If you ever need anything, ever you write to that address. We'll help you. We'll sponsor you to come to America if you want. We'll make sure you have whatever you need." Haruko accepted the paper, holding it like something precious. She spoke for a long time, and Nakamura translated with visible emotion. She says she doesn't want payment or reward. She says knowing you're alive is enough. But she thanks you for the address, for the promise, for treating her not as an enemy, but as a friend. She says when the war is truly over, not just the fighting, but the hatred too. Maybe then she will write. Maybe then she will visit this place called Ohio and meet your mother and see where you grew up. She says she wants to believe in a world where that's possible. Miller pulled Haruko into a gentle embrace, both of them crying now. "It will be possible. I'll make it possible. You saved my life, and I swear to you I'll spend the rest of it trying to deserve what you did." They parted at the gates of Camp Zaragoza. Miller boarding a truck that would take him to Manila and then to his next assignment. Haruko stood with Washington and Betty watching until the dust cloud disappeared into the distance. "Will you really see him again?" Washington asked through Nakamura. Haruko's answer was firm. "Yes, in a world at peace when hatred has died and only memory remains, I will go to Ohio. I will meet his mother. I will see this America that produces men like him and Dr. Washington and Nurse Coleman. And I will show them that Japan, too, can produce people capable of mercy." She touched the scar on her leg visible through her skirt. "This mark will remind me. This mark will tell me that what I did mattered, that the pain had purpose, that one life saved is worth everything." Washington would remember this moment for the rest of his life. Standing in the Philippine sun, watching an enemy turned friend prepare to return to a devastated homeland, knowing that somewhere in the vast machinery of war and hatred, two people had found a way to choose mercy instead. 20 years later, Dr. Samuel Washington stood before a classroom of medical students at Cook County Hospital in Chicago. His hair was streaked with gray, now his face lined by 2 decades of surgery and teaching and fighting quiet battles against prejudice that never quite died. But his hands were still steady, his voice still strong, and his passion for medicine had only deepened with time. "Today I want to tell you about a patient I treated in the Philippines in 1945, he began. "I want to tell you about the smell that made everyone in my medical tent run outside to vomit. And I want to tell you what I found when I looked beneath that smell, when I chose to see past the disgust to the story written in infected tissue and dying flesh." He told them everything. Haruko's story, Miller's story, the impossible choice and the terrible cost, and the reunion that had proven mercy could survive even war. When he finished, the classroom was absolutely silent. A student raised her hand. "Dr. Washington, what happened to them? To the woman and the soldier?" Washington smiled and walked to his desk, opening a wooden box he had brought specifically for this lecture. Inside were letters, dozens of them, spanning 2 decades. "Let me show you," he said. He read excerpts painting a picture across years. Haruko returning to Hiroshima to find her family had survived the atomic bomb. Miller coming home to Dayton, working in his father's hardware store, never forgetting his promise. The letters they exchanged slowly at first, then with increasing frequency, as Japan rebuilt and the hatred cooled. Miller's sponsorship application in 1948, bringing Haruko to America. Her arrival in Ohio, her enrollment in nursing school, her determination to earn American credentials and work as an RN. The Thanksgiving dinner in 1950, where she met Miller's mother and his fiancée Emily, and how Emily had embraced her as a sister. Miller's wedding in 1953, where Haruko stood as an honored guest, her scar visible beneath her dress, hem a mark she refused to hide. The birth of Miller's first child in 1955, and how they had asked Haruko to be the godmother. The photograph from 1960 showing Haruko at a 4th of July barbecue teaching Miller's children how to make onigiri while they taught her the rules of baseball. "She never remarried," Washington said quietly. "She told me once that Kenji was her husband for one life, and that was enough. But she found a family anyway. She found purpose. She worked as a nurse at a veterans hospital in Dayton, caring for the same soldiers who might once have been her enemies. And she never not once hid the scar on her leg. He pulled out one final item, a photograph taken just last year. Three people standing together at a Veterans Day ceremony. Haruko, now 47 years old, her hair gray, but her eyes still bright. Miller, 42, prosperous and healthy, his arm around his wife Emily. And Washington himself, 54, retired from surgery, but never from teaching. This was taken at a ceremony honoring humanitarian actions during the war, Washington explained. Haruko was given a commendation by the Veterans of Foreign Wars, an American organization honoring a Japanese woman for saving an American soldier at great personal cost. When they asked her to speak, do you know what she said? He didn't wait for an answer. She said that the scar on her leg reminded her every day that mercy requires sacrifice, that love demands risk, that the most important choice a human being can make is to value life over convenience, compassion over prejudice, humanity over hatred. She said the infection nearly killed her, but that what would have truly killed her was walking away from a dying man because she was afraid. Washington closed the box of letters and looked at his students. When you encounter a patient who smells so bad you want to turn away, remember Haruko. When you face a choice between following protocol and following your conscience, remember what she did. And when someone tries to tell you that people from different worlds, different sides, different colors or creeds or countries can never truly understand each other, remember that a Japanese woman and an American farm boy proved them wrong. He touched the wooden box gently. Mercy leaves scars, but those scars are proof that we chose love over fear, life over death, humanity over all the lies that war tries to teach us. And in the end, that's the only thing that matters. The students sat in silence for a long moment after Washington finished. Then slowly one began to applaud, then another. Within seconds, the entire classroom was on its feet, clapping for a story that had happened 2 decades ago, for two people most of them would never meet, for a lesson that transcended medicine and touched something deeper. That evening, Washington sat in his office and wrote a letter to Haruko. He told her about the lecture, about the students' reaction, about how her story continued to inspire new generations to believe in mercy. He wrote about seeing her and Miller the previous month, about how their friendship had endured across decades, about how their impossible act of compassion had rippled outward, touching more lives than they could ever count. And he wrote about his own gratitude for the reminder she had given him in that Philippine medical tent, that beneath every smell, every wound, every circumstance that made you want to turn away, there was a human being with a story worth knowing. He sealed the letter and addressed it to Dayton, Ohio, to the angel who smelled like hell, who had taught him the true meaning of courage. In Japan, in the rebuilt city of Hiroshima, a different kind of remembrance was taking place. Haruko's story had eventually made its way back to her homeland, carried by journalists and historians interested in tales of reconciliation. She was sometimes called upon to speak, to share her experience, to explain why she had chosen to save an enemy. Her answer was always the same. I looked at his face and saw my husband. I looked at his photograph and saw my mother. When you see the humanity in someone's side stop mattering, there is only the choice between life and death, mercy and cruelty. I chose life. I would choose it again. The scar on her thigh had faded over decades but remained visible, a pale line against darker skin, a permanent reminder of 2 months of infection and pain. Grandchildren would ask about it, and she would tell them the story, always ending the same way. This is not a mark of suffering. This is a mark of purpose. This is proof that I did something that mattered, that saved a life, that made the world slightly better than it was before. Some people leave their mark through greatness. I left mine through mercy. And I would rather be remembered for mercy than for anything else. The angel who smelled like hell lived until 1989, dying peacefully in Dayton, Ohio, surrounded by the Miller family who had adopted her as their own. At her funeral, attended by 3 generations of Millers and former patients from the Veterans Hospital, where she had worked for 35 years, Tommy Miller gave the eulogy. Haruko Tanaka saved my life in a Philippine jungle in 1945. But that's not what I remember most. What I remember is that she taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. That courage isn't about fighting. It's about choosing mercy when mercy is hardest. It's about valuing life when it would be easier to walk away. It's about being willing to suffer so that someone else might live. He touched his chest where beneath his shirt he carried a small piece of the original fabric she had cut from his uniform, the piece Dr. Washington had preserved and eventually returned to him. She carved mercy into her own flesh. She wore the scar proudly for 44 years, and she never once regretted what it cost her. If that's not heroism, then I don't know what is. They buried her in Woodland Cemetery in Dayton under a stone that read simply, Haruko Tanaka, 1918 to 1989, the angel who smelled like hell. Beneath that one line in Japanese and English, mercy requires sacrifice, but the sacrifice is always worth it. And in a museum in Washington, D.C., in a section dedicated to humanitarian actions during World War II, there hangs a photograph of three people standing together in a Philippine medical tent in August 1945. A black doctor with tired eyes and steady hands, a young American soldier with gratitude written on his face, and a small Japanese woman with a bandaged leg smiling despite everything, proof that even in hell angels can be found. The fabric they carried between them, preserved under glass, tells its own story. T. Miller, O positive, angel, words written in blood that dried to brown, but never faded, never lost their meaning, never stopped reminding anyone who saw them that mercy, real mercy, requires us to be willing to bleed. The smell that drove everyone away became the story that drew everyone close. The infection that nearly killed her became the proof of love's power. And the scar she refused to hide became the mark of mercy that changed everyone who knew its origin. In the end, Haruko Tanaka was right. Pain has purpose. Scars have meaning. And sometimes the worst smell in the world is hiding the most beautiful story ever told.